May I also ask everyone to please silence your cell phones at this time? Keep meaning to put a note on the door because people come in late with their cell phones on, and invariably it happens. I also just want to remind everybody about this program. It will be interrupted a little bit in early March. This is a 5-week program, and it will run today, next week on the 16th, the following week on the 23rd, and then we'll join here again on March 16th and 23rd. So we'll skip the first 2 Fridays of March, and we'll be back on the 16th and 23rd. It's nice that they mirror, so hopefully we'll all remember that. And we're very excited about this program today. I was recently in Seville, and it's an exciting time to be there because there are 22 exhibitions that are celebrating the 400th anniversary of the birth of the artist that we're celebrating in this program and in our installation upstairs, Bartolome Esteban Murillo. I only saw a handful of those, but it's great that we have the installation that we have here at the Meadows right now as part of this larger celebration of this artist who is such an important native son to Seville. Our speaker today is Rebecca Quinn Teresi. She is a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. Rebecca's dissertation topic is on images of the Immaculate Conception and the rhetorics of purity in Golden Age Spain. She should be known to all of you as she was our Meadows Cress Prado Fellow from 2015 to 2016 and was here. And she also curated a recent exhibition that we had last year, the Festival Book of San Fernando, celebrating sainthood in Baroque Seville, that was in the fall of 2016. Prior to her work at the Meadows, she held the Carlson Cowart Fellowship in the Prints and Drawings and Photographs Department at the Baltimore Museum of Art, as well as the Michael Bromberg Fellowship in the Department of Prints and Drawings at the British Museum, London. More recently, Rebecca taught a course on patronage and collecting at the Early Modern European Court at Johns Hopkins University as a Dean's Teaching Fellow, and she is currently finishing her dissertation with the support of the Cazell Dissertation Completion Fellowship at Johns Hopkins. It is precisely Rebecca's focus on the purity of the Virgin in Golden Age painting, as Murillo was such a master of the subject, that we wanted her to come in for this program. And we're delighted that she accepted to present as part of the Luis Martin lecture series with this 5-week course, Murillo, Artistic Intelligence and the Spanish Golden Age. So please join me in welcoming Rebecca Teresi.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you especially to Scott. Yes, can you hear me? Everyone, even everyone in the back? Good. I would, of course, like to thank everyone at the Meadows Museum for their support and, of course, for the invitation to deliver this series. It's always a pleasure to be back here, and I see familiar faces in the audience as well as in the gallery, so it always feels like coming home to be back here at the Meadows. Just before we begin, I wanted to ask how many of you attended Professor Jasinski's lecture series? So quite a few of you, which means that you heard his wonderful introduction to many of these topics that we'll be treating today, as his last lecture, I believe, was on Murillo. So because he's given you that wonderful background, we'll be able to go even further into the life and career of Murillo. But for those of you, the few of you who probably may have missed out on Professor Jasinski's lectures, you won't be lost, as we'll still repeat and give you context. So I also created this handout, which some of you may have gotten at the door. You don't need it for the lecture, but I thought you might like to have it afterwards. It's a timeline that will help you get a grip on all of the many things we're going to talk about today, because we'll be going through essentially his entire career in this first lecture. And then on the back, I've also included recommended further reading for those of you who like to get in the library. If you wanted to buy one book, I would recommend that you buy Amanda Wunder's brand new book on Baroque Seville, as it goes into great depth on a lot of these themes that we'll be treating throughout the lecture series. And it's a beautiful book that any Hispanist would love to have in their library. As you probably already know, 2017 and of course into 2018 is the Año de Murillo, a celebration of the 400th anniversary of the artist's birth. And of course, Important pictures have been restored as part of this celebration, new scholarship has been published, and important exhibitions have been mounted across the globe. Among these number, of course, our own exhibition upstairs, which I don't have an image of as it hasn't been shot yet, but there's also the show up at the Frick, which some of you may have had the opportunity to see in New York. It's there through this weekend before it goes to London, on his self-portraits. And also, as Scott mentioned, the multitude of exhibitions now in Seville, which have been complemented by a lot of wonderful cultural programming. And here we see a reconstruction of the cycle for the Capuchinos that Murillo did, brought together for the first time since the 19th century and back at the Museo de Bellas Artes in Seville. Murillo is an artist whose work can support such a tremendous number of simultaneous exhibitions, both because he works in a number of genres, so you can approach his work in in multitude of ways, but also because of the sheer number of works in his catalog. And they number over 420 paintings, and many of them are monumental size. So you might remember that Velázquez's catalog has only about 125 works, and their careers were about the same length. So you can see how productive Murillo was during his career. And what's more, his work can be found all over the globe in almost every major European and American museum, given the absolute craze for the artist's work in the 19th century. This unbridled enthusiasm to collect works by Murillo is perhaps a reflection of the universal appeal of his style. It's very sweet. It's famous for being sweet, but it is this sweetness which is also to blame for his less than stellar critical fortune in the 20th and even into the 21st century. And I would draw your attention to one recent review of the exhibition at the Frick that calls his style high fructose, which I find rather offensive, but I think it tells us more about the reviewer's ignorance of Murillo's capacity to create very intelligent works. He engaged with the intellectual, theological, and sociocultural debates of his age in a very serious way. Just to this point, he founded the first formal artistic academy in Spain, and that was in Seville in 1660. He grappled with the same representational challenges that other greats of Baroque Spanish art did, and indeed he was the only artist of the Spanish Golden Age, apart from Ribera, to achieve a truly international reputation during his lifetime. Because of this sheer number of works in his catalog, again, over 420 works, and not to mention the dozens of drawings in his catalog, and as we will see over the course of the series, Murillo was a superb draftsman, and this is one thing that he has a leg up on Velázquez, because we have so few sheets that are traceable to Velázquez's hand, but Murillo has quite an impressive catalog of drawings. But because of this tremendously large body of work, our lecture series will necessarily be constrained. So instead of trying to tackle everything, I've chosen to focus over the course of the 5 meetings. And I've just put this up to show, yes, the shadow of Velázquez is long, but Murillo holds his own. I think my slides are slightly out of order. Okay. So our first lecture will be today. We'll be dealing with Murillo's Seville, and we'll briefly examine the beginning of his career before moving to the major ecclesiastical commissions that made him such a success, and we'll also discuss the networks of patronage that made his flourishing career possible. Next week, we'll turn to his pictures of children and genre scenes, the work for which he is perhaps best known. And then we will evaluate Murillo's involvement in contemporary theopolitical debates and efforts to bolster Seville's declining status in the 3rd meeting. And that's namely his contributions to the debate over the Immaculate Conception and of the canonization campaign for San Fernando. After a 2-week break, we will then turn to his immediate legacy in his foundation of the Academy, his practice of drawing, and his vision of self through his self-portraits. And in our fifth and final meeting, we will examine the Murillo craze that struck the 19th century, the fate of his multitudinous oeuvre, and his influence on later painters. And I just wanted to point your attention to this slide, which shows, you might recognize in Florence at the Palazzo Pitti, and you see here a room full of spectacular works, including Rubens, and here's a Rubens flanked by two Murillos. So he's not an artist to be underestimated. He was considered on par with Titian and Van Dyck at one point. Even though we might dispute that claim today, I think we shouldn't underestimate Murillo. And I hope you'll agree with me by the end of this series. So without any further ado, let us turn to Murillo's Seville. On New Year's Day, 1618, which is just 400 years ago and some change, the infant Murillo, he was likely only a few days old. The custom at the time was to baptize infants as quickly as possible, so we know that he was probably born in the last days of December 1617. He was baptized in the parish church of La Magdalena in Seville, and the font actually still exists, and this commemorative plaque here, that the photo was actually taken by our own Scott Winterroad on his recent trip to Seville. The font still exists, but the church does not. It was lost to the 19th century, like so many other early modern buildings. But Murillo spent his entire life in Seville, and it could be said that Murillo is Seville and Seville is Murillo. And if you go to Seville this year, as Scott mentioned, that will become eminently clear. Just as you might argue that Toledo made El Greco, I think the same thing could be said of Murillo. So I think it would be worth it to spend a little bit of time, even though you heard a lot about 17th century Seville with Professor Jasinski, I think it will be valuable to spend a little bit of time recapping what the situation was like in Seville in the age of Murillo. By the time he was born, Seville was entering a difficult period marked by decades of crisis. Situated on the Guadalquivir River, whose navigability made Seville the port of call for the Spanish World Empire, it had grown prosperous, and just to give you some sense of that prosperity, 17,637 tons of silver came through the city before flooding the European markets between the period of 1503 and 1660. It also was very populous, with a peak population in 1600 of about 150,000 people, which made it one of the largest cities in Europe. That might not seem like much to us today, given that that's more or less the population of Waco, Texas. But if you compare this to other big cities at the time, Madrid, for example, had only about 65,000 people, and Rome about 80,000. And the catchphrase for Seville at this time is, "He who has not seen Seville has not seen a marvel." And you can see that in this print from the period. It was a hub of international commerce, and the resulting cosmopolitan culture that would come with that is what contributed to Murillo's career. But the golden age of Seville was not to last. It's true that Spain in general experienced a century of crisis in the 17th century, but Seville in particular suffered. The bustling trade with the Americas that had lined the city's pockets handsomely from the 16th century had been put into jeopardy by diminishing returns from American mines, shipments lost to pirates and storms, and the devastating silting of the Guadalquivir River. And when you hear that Seville is the port of call for America, you might think, well, Seville is inland, but actually, as you can see from the map here, ships could come in through the Guadalquivir before stopping at Seville, but as the ships became bigger and bigger and heavier, and the river started silting up, this became less and less possible, and trade started diverting to Cadiz here, which you can see would have been a little bit easier to navigate if you were steering a very large 17th century ship full of heavy silver. The environmental disaster of the Guadalquivir silting up would secure the end of the civilian economic golden age. And eventually in 1680, the crown moves the official port of trade to Cadiz, and this is right at the end of Murillo's life. So it ended the monopoly on the New World trade that the city had held for over a century. Can you imagine if they moved the New York Stock Exchange to Chicago or something, what would happen to Wall Street? It was a devastating blow. Beyond economic woes, the city was experiencing severe natural disasters and population decline. And I'm just going to put up another view of Seville to illustrate the period. A major flood hit the city in 1626, destroying thousands of houses in addition to crops. And at this time, we have reports of certain churches only being accessible by boats. So imagine Seville as Venice in 1626. And then in 1649, and this is something we'll return to several times in the course of the lecture series, a devastating plague swept through Seville, cutting the population in half over the course of 4 horrific months. And to make it slightly more personal for all of you, Zurbaran's 29-year-old son, Juan, was one of the fallen. This, of course, if you imagine all of the field hands, half of them die. Well, what happens next? Famine, because there's nobody to harvest the crops. No one was tending to them. It hit in the springtime, which you can imagine is not a great time if you're farming, to have a plague hit. And then popular uprisings ensued. The battered populace was hungry and poor, and there was a revolt in 1652 that had to be put down by the civilian nobility. And by 1660, the declining fate of Seville was sealed. Continued famine and natural disasters, such as the 1680 earthquake that shook the Giralda like a, quote, cypress beaten by the wind, could not but be interpreted by the very pious population of Seville as divine punishment for something that they were doing wrong. And who could blame them for thinking that with that many awful things happening to the city over the course of just a few decades? Nevertheless, the same period witnessed the flourishing of the arts in Seville. There was still immense wealth, but just concentrated among the mercantile elite, and a powerful ecclesiastical hierarchy with a devout population created the perfect environment for a vibrant artistic scene, particularly when it comes to religious art, at which Murillo excelled. Furthermore, if you look at these crises as a sign of divine punishment, well, what are things that you can do to court divine favor, to turn the tides? Building churches and decorating them is one thing that they thought was an answer to the problem. And also, Wunder, in her recent book, has pointed out that this funding of the arts was also a job creator for a depressed economy, which is another important factor to take into consideration. So from the mid-17th century on, Murillo became the most popular painter of his generation in Seville by any estimation. And even his long shadow is cast into the 19th century, and there are so many paintings from this period depicting his career, and they're quite fun. So this is by a Scottish painter depicting the early career of Murillo, and you see the young painter here kind of hawking his small-scale works in a flea market type space. And this does come from Palomino, the great art history, the first art historian of Spain and the great art theorist, but also painter. We have an Immaculate Conception by Palomino in our collection here at the Meadows. But Palomino does tell us that at the beginning of his career, he probably sold in contexts like this. So this period, over 30 different ecclesiastical construction projects were undertaken, and there was just a vibrant flourishing of the ecclesiastical arts, which Murillo very much benefited from during his career. So before we get to those early works, I just want to mention that Murillo's own biography is almost as tragic as the history of 17th century Seville. He was born to a moderately affluent barber surgeon named Gaspar Esteban, and his wife was Maria Perez Murillo, and he was the youngest of 14 children. And that would be good for Murillo because by the time he was 10, both his mother and father were dead. And so he was taken in by one of his older sisters. And through her family connections, he apprenticed, when he was just hitting puberty, he apprenticed with the painter Juan del Castillo, And he even thought about going to the Americas in 1633, but luckily for art history, that never happened. And in 1645, he got married in the same church where he was baptized. And with his wife, Beatriz, he would have at least 9 children. So with so many mouths to feed, you can imagine that's part of why Murillo is such a prolific artist. His early works show a certain level of awkwardness, and we're just going to fly through these so we can get to his more mature style, but you can see they almost look nothing like the Murillo that we're all familiar with. Particularly, I'll draw your attention to this painting in Cambridge, where the figures almost look like they've been cut and pasted. It's almost a collage effect. And the style, he's just sort of borrowing left, right, and center from all of the different artists of his time in Seville. And you can see the influence, I think, especially of Zurbarán, but also of his master, Juan del Castillo. This, I think, is the best picture from his early career, and it's in Stockholm. And it does kind of anticipate some of the sweetness of his later style. It shows a more confident handling of the paint, but also it combines the heavenly and earthly realms, which is a motif that we'll see him grappling with throughout his career, with more and more increasing sophistication. So in 1645, in the same year that he was married, he won his first major commission, and this is the most important commission to date in his career for the Claustro Chico, or small cloister, of the Church of San Francisco el Grande, which is also now destroyed, and it was replaced in the 19th century by the Plaza Nueva. So you probably are familiar with this plaza if you've ever been to Seville, and would have never realized that there was a large convent there in the 17th century. And this is the only element that remains. It's not part of the facade, but it was a gate that led in to the church. So the series was 11 paintings. 10 survive. 1 was lost with the French invasion. And it's fascinating that this very young Murillo, he's only 27 years old, would have won such a huge commission, particularly since this same type of series, paintings of visions and monks for a cloister, was Zurbarán's bread and butter just a decade before. And Zurbarán is still around, but he is less and less in demand. And we see here a reconstruction of the way that the paintings would have originally been hung in the cloister, and it's every conservator's nightmare because they were hung outside. And they were hung, you can imagine the pigeons that probably like to roost in those little spaces in the cloister. But there they did hang for 150 years. And they're fine. I can't wait till I have to tell you about what happens to San Antonio in just a few moments. But these images do show a debt to local artists. You can think immediately of Zurbarán. His compositions are still a little awkward. There's kind of a stilted arrangement of the figures you can see here, but he's already experimenting with genre figures, which will become the hallmark of his career, as we'll see next week. And there is a kind of an empathetic quality to his works already that we see developing more and more over the course of his career. I believe Professor Jasinski talked about this painting from North Carolina in some depth with you, so we will just fly by until we get to my favorite paintings from the series. And these are not them, but I just want you to be able to see, get a kind of a sense of his work. I think these pictures show a debt to Ribera, and we can see Murillo's still kind of trying to figure out what his place is, what his style is, and he's borrowing from all of the wonderful works that he sees in Seville, because of course Seville had a fabulous collection of art, both in private hands, but also in the churches and monasteries. The Death of St. Clair is another, I think he's a little more successful here than in the earlier compositions that I showed you. There's a harmony, a lyricism, a flow that we will see develop over the course of his career. And I included 2 slides. This one has lower resolution but better color. This one has awful color but better resolution. I actually took this from a book, so sadly this isn't in the painting. This is just the seam from the catalog raisonné where I got the image. But it does give you a sense of what he's working on at this time. And we can compare it. This is a terrible slide, but I did want you to see what Valdés-Leal is doing. He borrows later from Murillo, and not nearly as successfully, even the terrible slide notwithstanding. So we see Valdés-Leal emerging as his greatest competitor in this period, and then within a few years, there's absolutely no competition, and Murillo wins the most important competition of the day, and is indeed much better paid than poor Valdés-Leal. My 2 favorite paintings from the series are the one at the Clark here, and then another one at the Louvre. So to treat this Clark painting in a little bit more detail, it illustrates a vision in which this friar here saw the soul of Philip II ascending into heaven, which is one of the most Spanish themes imaginable. You wouldn't really see this kind of image anywhere else. And you can just see the soul here in this detail, and again he is grappling with how to depict visions. And the subject of visionary art in Spain has been studied very extensively before, and I can certainly recommend more reading on that topic if anyone is interested. But we see the vision in the background, but then in the foreground we're very much grounded in the earthly, and you almost feel as though the figures were plucked from the streets of Seville, and indeed some have suggested that this might be a self-portrait, although not a very flattering one, I would say. But he is including faces that seem like they could be traceable to somebody in his circle in Seville in this period, if only we knew, if only we had more portraits available to compare them to. The other most interesting work, and again this slide is not great, for some reason the Louvre does not make their images publicly accessible. They're some of the best paintings in the world are at the Louvre, and yet when you're trying to teach works that are in the Louvre, it's such a challenge because you almost can't find decent images of anything. But this was a picture, also part of the series, and it also depicts a vision. This guy was from a nearby town and worked in the kitchens of this very convent for something like 30 years. And he wasn't a very good cook because he was always getting distracted by prayer. So I guess he was a very good Christian, but not a good cook. So here we see an episode in which he gets completely wrapped up in his prayer, to the point where we can see Murillo suggested that he's left the earthly realm and has ascended into kind of a liminal space between heaven and earth, right? He's having this visionary experience, and then he wakes up. Now, I think that this is him again. I think that this is the second part of the narrative. Not every art historian agrees, but I am at the podium, so you will have to take my interpretation. And I think that the face is the same. But again, I don't have a very good image to convince you of that. So he wakes up from his vision, and he finds that all of the work has been done. And of course, who did it? The angels. And he's discovered by other brothers, but also noblemen. But the best part about this painting, I think, is the fact that Murillo took this religious scene as an opportunity to experiment with still life, and I think you could study this and learn a lot about how cooking was done in the 17th century. You see an angel laying out plates. Another here is grinding spices with a mortar and pestle. Back here, he's stirring a pot over the fire. You can see how they would feed the fire there. And down here, you even see vegetables. And I know some, not with this particular painting, but some historians of food have used Baroque paintings to try to reconstruct the difference between the produce that we have now with all the modifications that we've done over the centuries, with what things like eggplants and peppers and tomatoes look like in the period. But the bottom line is this is his first big commission, but it almost looks nothing like what we might consider typical of Murillo. in some of these images, you see him using that kind of dark brown, reddish brown ground that you see a lot in early Velázquez, but also in Zurbarán. And that is the typical civilian way to prepare the canvas. But he gets further and further away from that as his career goes on and his style develops. And Palomino, again, this art historian with whom you are probably all familiar, points out that the works are so different from what he did later that if it were not so well known that it was his, hardly anyone would recognize it as such. And I think Palomino is absolutely right about that. So fast forwarding at a completely breakneck pace, we are moving 10 years forward to 1655, when his popularity with the local and ecclesiastical elite was growing. He would, like I mentioned, have to compete for a few years with other artists like Valdés Leal and more seriously with Francisco de Herrera the Younger, who he had returned to Seville in this period. He famously got along terribly with his father. His father was kind of an old coot, and even into the grave made life difficult for his son. So he had to come down and deal with a contested will situation, and then ends up picking up a lot of important commissions in Seville. So he's a competitor, but also an influencer on Murillo's style. So here we are turning to the Cathedral of Seville, one of the largest cathedrals in the world. And he wins a commission, a very important commission, for the Chapel of San Antonio, which is where they have their baptismal font. And this would be perhaps even a bigger opportunity for Murillo because this is a publicly visible commission. So in the cloister, only the monks are able to see the works that he does. But here, everybody in Seville and everyone who's passing through will be able to see his reputation. And this is what really builds his career. So it's a visionary painting again, and it's one of his most celebrated and iconic works, and I think it is a good marker of his transition into the true high Baroque style. But we still do see the earthly scene below grounded in what we might recognize from his early style with that more Zurbarán quality. There's almost sculptural quality and there's a weightiness to the way he executes the figures, and we can see that here. But it's still in situ, and he was influenced, like I said, by Herrera, who had done this allegory of the Eucharist and the Immaculate Conception just the year before. But Murillo here, the canvas is almost overtaken by the angels. The vision is the first thing you notice, and then your eye is drawn down, and you start to notice some of the elements he's included, including still life. And Palomino tells us that this is one of his most famous works, and he puts the desk, I just want to draw your attention to this portion of the quote, "A desk placed with such art that there are those who testify to having seen a bird laboring to sit on it so as to peek at the white lilies there in a vase." And we can see that vase here. And of course, this trope you might recognize. It comes from all the way from antiquity. Pliny tells us about birds going for grapes. It's just a way to prove that the artist has, if he's able to deceive nature, he's really made it as an artist. But I do think that it is interesting to consider the development of his style. The painting, if you were upset by what you learned about the cloister at San Francisco the works being hung outside, you'll be even more upset to learn that in 1874, a thief actually, I don't know what the security was like in the 19th century in Seville Cathedral, apparently wasn't very good, because a thief cut out the figure of St. Anthony from the canvas and tried to sell it in New York. But luckily, the dealer apparently saved the day. The dealer he tried to sell it to and sent it back, and they were able to restore it. Now, I didn't know this part of the painting's history last time I was in Seville, so next time I go, I'm going to look closely and see how good. In raking light, you can always, it almost makes you cringe as much as the Roque B. Venus being chopped up by the suffragette, almost. So we'll move on here. In 1658, we see Murillo has his documented trip to Madrid to the court, and this is the only documented time that we see Murillo leaving Seville at all. Although he may have gone to court earlier, we certainly know he was there in April of 1658, but that he was back in Seville by the end of the year. So he was there for a very brief time, but it was extremely impactful on his career because he would have met with, of course, Velázquez, who was a fellow Sevillano, and also in charge of the royal collection. So he would have had complete access to the fabulous collection of Titians, Rubens, and Van Dycks. I would argue Veronese, too, would prove influential. And as I mentioned earlier, he's a prolific draftsman, so he would have been sketching after all of these works. And we know that copying was, of course, a fundamental part of artistic practice in this period, and he would have been in good company copying, as this is the famous Spinners by Velázquez, in which he includes a copy of Titian and, again, a copy of Rubens, right? And I think that it is likely that Murillo would have encountered this work if he was there in 1658. So he didn't ever leave Spain, and this is something surprising to foreigners, right? As Palomino tells us, who do not want to grant the laurels of fame to any Spaniard unless he has passed through the custom house of Italy, without realizing that Italy has come to Spain in its statues, eminent paintings, prints, and books, and that the study of the model with these antecedents abounds everywhere. So you didn't have to go to Italy because Italy is in Spain. And it's true that the best collection of Titians in the world at this period, and even in our own, was not in Venice, but in Spain, because the Habsburgs were the absolute best collectors of Titian, but also of other important artists. So I just want to, I know we're focusing mainly on series, but I want to draw your attention to this, which is his next most important commission after he returns from Madrid. And you can really see the huge difference that was made by his exposure to the royal collection and to the other artists working in Madrid. And it's the same year that he paints this work, he founds the Artistic Academy in Seville. And I can't help but wonder if Velázquez's own battle that we must all be pretty familiar with for the status of the artist, and that we see emblematized in his most famous work, Las Meninas, I think that he would have been having these same conversations with Murillo, and I can't help but think that Murillo would have been inspired by this encounter in his mission to found the Academy. And I bring this comparison because this is the type of work that Valdés Leal, this is upstairs, this is the type of work that Valdés Leal is doing in the same period. And as you can see at this point, there's little reason to think that they compete with each other. Murillo has outpaced him by any estimation. By 1663, his career had exploded. He is completely upwardly mobile, and he rents a very fancy house that has running water, which in the 17th century is quite a feat. And this is in the well-heeled parish of San Bartolome, and this is the same neighborhood that his most important patrons are living in, so you can tell he's really made it big by this time. Unfortunately, that same year saw his wife's death in childbed. He would never remarry again. He poured himself into his work after this. And the Palomino just points out that yes, there's a big change in his style. All of a sudden, he starts focusing more and more on color, less sculptural quality, less of a Zurbaran type work, and more influenced by the painters he would have seen in Madrid. There's no doubt that his style becomes very painterly by the end of his career. So now we turn to his next most important commission. Again, we're fast forwarding almost 10 years. to the series he did for Santa Maria la Blanca, which was a small parish church, and actually it was a former synagogue. It was in the Juderia, and it was transformed from 1662 through 1665 into just a Baroque spectacular. It was called by an 18th century observer a tacita de oro, or a little golden cup. It was also called in the 20th century an example of ornamental delirium, and I think both could be convincingly argued. But the renovation of the church was celebrating a victory for the Immaculates, and we'll hear more about that in 2 weeks. But essentially, it was dedicated to the Virgin. And when the church was completed and Murillo's series was installed, there was a huge festival, including all sorts of elaborate ephemera. And I've taken this reconstruction from the Catalogue Raisonné that's on your handout. And we know from this author, who again we'll hear a lot more about in 2 weeks, Fernando de la Torre Farfán, he tells us exactly what everything looked like during these celebrations, including this ephemeral altarpiece that had works by Murillo, but also by Herrera the Younger. The mastermind behind this renovation is Justino de Neve. This portrait is actually very famous, and Palomino tells us that dogs would bark at the dog, again, participating in that antique trope of images fooling nature. But De Neve was a canon of the Cathedral of Seville. He was the son of a wealthy Flemish merchant, and he was one of Murillo's closest friends. And he was not only his friend, again, but his neighbor, as I mentioned earlier, and they all lived in the neighborhood very close to this church. And he commissioned this series, and indeed we can see his embedded portrait in one of the paintings to which we will turn our attention now. He painted 4 lunettes for the church. They have all been dispersed. One is in the Louvre, another is in a very fancy country house in the UK, and then the 2 larger lunettes are in Madrid. And I just want to point out now that these golden relief images are a 19th century addition, so don't become too attached to them. And this is a reconstruction of how the works would have originally been installed in the lateral aisles. And even though they're not in situ any longer, as part of the Año de Murillo, an artist, a contemporary artist, was commissioned to make copies. So if you do visit Santa Maria la Blanca from now on, you will see copies of Murillo's canvases. So if we turn our attention to this image from the Louvre, where we see the embedded portrait of Justino de Neve, we also see this is most likely the priest of the parish at the time. And again, he's engaging with this visionary idea, but now instead of equal weight being given to the earthly experience and the heavenly one, it's almost exclusively a heavenly experience, and you just see those having the vision kind of off to the side in both pictures, framing the lunettes and drawing your eye towards the vision. And in this case, in the Louvre, it's the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, and you can see the way he's so delicately described these putti, the little heads of the angels, that you almost would miss if you weren't looking closely. And I think this is emblematic of his later style and his very confident handling. Now, the bigger paintings are even more painterly. They're both now in the Prado. They were stolen by the French and then given back. It's a whole long story. But they depict the founding of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. It's the legend of the Virgins of the Snow, the Virgin of the Snows, I should say. This patrician named Joannes and his wife, they fall asleep, and the Virgin appears to them in a dream. They're childless, and they want to donate their fortune to the Virgin, but they just don't know how. And she tells them that they're to build a church where they find a site covered in snow. And this seems like a very odd directive, given that it's August in Rome. Snow is not a very likely thing to encounter at that time of year in Rome, as you might imagine. But they rush off to the Pope, And we see this part of the narrative unfolding in the other lunette. And he is completely surprised because he had the same vision too. And then in the background here, you see them processing up to the hill where they eventually build this basilica that is to be the first church dedicated to the Virgin in Rome. And this is a 4th century story, but he's, of course, depicted everybody in contemporary clothes. But you can see his style is really in full swing. It shows rich and soft coloration, this fabulous diagonal arrangement of the composition, which would have been perfect because the images would have faced each other in the dome. And you can just see the mastery of color that Murillo achieves at this period. There's nothing garish about these colors, even though they're so highly saturated. And it's just his application of paint is incredible. My favorite thing about Murillo is the way he treats whites. And I think few artists can describe whites in the way that Murillo does. It's absolutely breathtaking. I think there's nothing high fructose about this as far as I'm concerned. But you see, you can appreciate this mature style even more, I would argue, in this lunette. If you look at this absolutely confident, choppy, and yet free brushwork that he uses to describe these passages here of the clothes and the carpet below the Pope. It is his painterly style in full swing. And when I say painterly, you can think about Velázquez, of course, as the master of painterly style. If you look at this detail from our painting upstairs and compare it, you think that, of course, Murillo did absorb everything and more that he encountered in Madrid. And this is, of course, inherited from Titian. And I've included a detail here on the right of a work by Titian that was in the royal collection by 1666. And then back, if we look at the vision, he's just become quite adept at arranging a composition. He's cleverly chosen to include these two figures in the corner, and that serves to draw our eye towards the procession here. And they're going up to the hill to choose the site for the church where the snow has fallen. And this subject, the construction and consecration of a famous Marian basilica, would of course been appropriate to include in the context of a renovation of a Marian church. But also, I should point out that there's a connection between the surname of the patron, Neve, and Nieve. So this is another way, besides including himself in the image of the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, Justino de Nieve is really like leaving his mark as patron. And as part of this shows us where the paintings were. Here's the dome, and the two Prado works were here. And then the Louvre painting is here, and the English painting is there. As part of the celebration, there was a large festival, as I mentioned, including a parade route, and also what has been called the most important public display of paintings in 17th century Spain. Paintings were hung publicly outside as part of these celebrations that belonged to the local elite, who had works by the likes of Raphael and Ribera, Rubens, Titian, but also works by Murillo were hung on the facade of the Villa Manrique Palace, which is just across the way. Here is the Church of Santa Maria la Blanca, and here is the Villa Manrique Palace. And we know all of this, of course, from Torre Farfán, who tells us everything you could ever want to know and more about these festivities. But the Jacob series, which I'm sure all of you will recognize because this fabulous monumental canvas is upstairs, they were hung on the front of the palace. And they've now been dispersed across the globe. 2 are in Russia, and this is, I think, at least 4 of the 5 canvases are meditations on deception, which is the dialectic between engaño and desengaño is so much a preoccupation of Spanish painters in this period that I think that an argument could be made for these works not just being a biblical, don't just take them at face value as biblical narratives, but instead as an allegory of what it means to paint and how to deal with deception. So yes, as you might remember from the biblical story, he's tricking his father through the senses. Like the sense of touch betrays his father because his father wants to bless Esau, right, who's the hairy one. But his mother, Rebecca, wants her favorite son to receive the blessing. And then we have the dream of Jacob and Rachel at the well. And then, of course, Jacob laying the peeled rods before the flocks. And here he's tricking nature, right? Because the sheep are amorous as they take in the water. And when they see these striped rods, something about the act of seeing influences nature, and the flocks come out spotted. And then another work in the series shows Rachel sitting on the idol she's stolen from her father. And again, deception is the key of this narrative. Palomino tells us, and you can review that as I'm speaking, Palomino tells us that Murillo did not set out to paint the landscapes. He actually subcontracted out the landscapes to Iriarte, but that they couldn't agree who would paint first because each one of them wanted to be the first to paint and kind of have creative control and let the other guy finish. And since they couldn't agree, Palomino says that Murillo just gives up and decides to do them himself. But the landscapes are quite variable, and I think looking closely between the 5 different examples, you might be able to see another hand, just based on style alone. This is an Iriarte compared with our picture upstairs, and I've included a detail of the landscapes. There is something similar there, and in fact, Claire Berry studied these in 2002 before the exhibition of Murillo's in American collections that was at the Kimball and LACMA. And you can see here, she sees that the figures here have been painted over the landscape. Do you see that line? So we'd have to ask her more about what she sees there, but the fact that the figures were painted on top of the landscape might suggest that there is a second hand at play. So that's a subject that deserves its own dedicated investigation. So now we're going to turn again at a breakneck speed to the final years of the 60s, and we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to fly through. But he works on the Hospital of the Santa Caridad, which is this fabulous institution. As you can imagine, with this plague killing off half the population in 1649, there was a big need for charity in Seville in this period, and charity was made fashionable by this guy. If you think about charity today, it's almost the same thing. Like, it's not your everyday Joe that's going to the Crystal Charity Ball here in Dallas. It's the upper crust of society, and the same was true in Seville. Charity became a mark of nobility, and Miguel Mañara, who is the patron of this institution, and its president. The institution predates Mañara, but he really makes it into what it is. And he goes on this campaign to redecorate the church and to expand the membership and expand the mission. The mission of the Brotherhood was originally to bury the dead. And again, with all these plague victims, you really needed somebody to bury the dead in Seville in the period. But he commissions a series of paintings from Murillo and from Valdés Leal to decorate the church. And Murillo is given the task of illustrating 6 of the 7 works of mercy. The 7th is burying the dead, which is depicted in the altarpiece. Now, the ones you see in red are actually copies. This is the church, but the one you see in red are copies because they were taken by the French, of course, like everything else decent, in the 19th century. And these were left. I'm not sure why they decided to leave the very large canvases, maybe because it was just too big to get down. But they took the rest. And this space is just famous, and Palomino tells us that anyone who enters this place becomes so absorbed that he is just basically stupefied, and he can't speak. And the masterstroke, I think, of this series is the direction Murillo has taken the 6 works of mercy. He's chosen to depict them in the context of biblical narratives. He's chosen for feeding the hungry. He's chosen the miracle of the loaves and fishes. For giving water to the thirsty, he's chosen Moses striking the rock. And these paintings were also recently restored. But sadly, my reproductions, I think, are pre-restoration. I couldn't find good images after the restoration in time for this series. But his mastery of a multi-figure composition is in full swing here. And we also see he's adapted this Italian trope of using what's called a festaiuolo. Yes. So this is this figure. It comes from the theater, but it's a figure who directs your attention to what you're supposed to see and what you're supposed to be paying attention to in the composition, particularly in such an overwhelmingly large composition like this, and one that's hung so high. And he's directing our attention to Moses here. And they are, again, hung very high and hard to see. This is the Loaves and Fishes. And you already see kind of genre figures making appearances here. So we'll think more about works like this, figures like this next week. So to go back to the church, these are the images that were taken, and of course they are just the most spectacular. Murillo's style is just, I mean, it takes such confidence to apply paint in such a precise and yet spontaneous way. It's almost paradoxical, his style, and his treatment of color and different textures is just so rich and fabulous. And I can't help but think he was thinking about Velázquez. This is 10 years after his trip to Madrid. But this is one of Velázquez's works that's at the Escorial, and it's about, it's recently been argued by Felipe Pereda that this is an allegory on the art of painting and painting as deception. That the tunic here that's been stained, just like a canvas is stained with pigment, is used to trick the father into thinking that Joseph was devoured by wild animals. But here, instead of the clothes becoming this falsified evidence, in Murillo's work, they represent the act of charity of clothing the naked. So the poor prodigal son has been taken back into the fold, and he will be clothed. So the charity is what's so important here. Here the dog is suspicious, and he's telling you, I don't believe a word these kids are saying. Here, the dog is exhibiting that kind of unconditional parental love. And I think that this is also just thinking about both painters' approach to painting, not only from a stylistic perspective, but from a thematic perspective. There's like a sweetness and empathy that you find in Murillo. There's a tenderness. Probably, maybe because he had so many kids. I don't know. So that, I think that's my absolute favorite. This one's my absolute favorite from the Santa Caridad. And we're running out of time, so I'm just going to go quickly, but you can just appreciate his style. And he's just come into his own. This one is in Canada, and this one is in St. Petersburg. This was the best slide that I could find. And you can see he's really good at these sort of sweet and tender scenes, right? But when you get to like a guy trapped in jail, that's not really Murillo's wheelhouse. And you can see this Ribera, I think, is quite a bit more effective as an image. Grim and gruesome and that sort of thing wasn't exactly Murillo's cup of tea. And then he also did altarpieces showing the saints doing works of charity, like carrying the poor on their backs. And the brothers of the Santa Caridad, and Murillo was a member of the Santa Caridad Brotherhood, probably because they wanted him to agree to do the paintings, they let him in. But they were supposed to carry the poor on their backs. And these are noblemen that are supposed to be doing this. And they're supposed to like approach with confidence people that have sores, all sorts of things are supposed to be completely charitable. The first thing they do when they get the poor into the hospital, or at least what they're supposed to do, is wash their feet and then kiss them. And Palomino tells us, again, the evocative quality of Murillo's work, where we see, he says that the boys getting their scabies removed almost screech. And the seventh work of charity is in the altarpiece, and then that's burying the dead, like I mentioned. Also, as part of the series, the two most famous works by Valdés Leal were commissioned. And you can see perhaps why Mañara chose Murillo for the sweet, charitable works, and then Valdés Leal for the gruesome, awful, decaying corpse type works. I don't think Murillo would have painted these quite so effectively. But they certainly do factor into the cycle, because the first thing you encounter when you come into the church are those awful scenes that remind you that this mortal life is completely temporary and all of the riches you've accumulated are going to be for nothing. And then you walk through and you see, okay, well, maybe if I do works of charity, then I won't go to hell, which is the goal of all Brothers of the Santa Caridad, I would say. And this shows us the organization of the paintings. And I've taken a lot of these from Amanda Wunder's book, which again I recommend that you have a look at. Finally, he did works for the Hospital de los Venerables Sacerdotes, which was another charitable foundation for aging priests. I'm only going to show you this one image, and this is perhaps Murillo's most famous painting. We'll be dealing a lot with this in week 3, but also in week 5. This was maybe the most famous painting in mid-19th century Paris. And it was given back to Spain in the early 40s. The Nazi collaborationist Vichy government in France made an agreement with the fascist government in Spain, and it was a very diplomatic coup to get this back. But I just want to point out how far we've come in terms of style. And this is the type of thing that he's doing at the end of his career. This is why he's called high fructose, even though, again, I find that offensive. But it's almost like a glamour shots Madonna and Child, if you think about it. And vaporous is the word that comes to mind and is used most often to describe his mature style. But his treatment of colors is just spectacular. And this just goes to show you how far he's come. And this map just shows you where he was born and where he was buried, and then these are the locations of all of the series that we've been talking about. First, the Santa Maria la Blanca, well, I guess really first the San Francisco, then the Cathedral, Santa Maria la Blanca, the Venerables, and this is the palace where our painting, along with the others, were exhibited as part of those festivities in '65, and then the Santa Caridad just outside of the walls of the city. So, as you might imagine, for an artist who has 420 works in his catalog, Murillo never stopped working, and indeed he worked himself to death. And his death is quite tragic, but also was famous. He was working on an altarpiece for a church in Cadiz. It just makes me more angry at Cadiz when they take the port and then they kill Murillo. He falls from the scaffolding while he's working on this. And actually the Academy of Fine Arts in Cadiz in the 19th century, in 1864, actually launched a competition, and the subject was the death of Murillo. And I think it's kind of like an apology, right, by the artists. And here we see this 19th century imagining of Murillo's death. And that is where I'm going to leave you. This is the plaza where the church where he was buried used to be and is now a plaza, but we can see that cross. And that's all we have time for today, so thank you so much. For those of you who have to go, go, and if anyone wants to ask a question now or after, please feel free. Yes, thank you.